Can I ask all members to take their seats? Mr. Schein has moved second reading of Bill 84, an act to amend Metrolinx Act 2006. All those in favor, please rise and remain standing.
Mr. Schein.
Mr. Schein.
Mr. Cleese.
Mr. Cleese.
Ms. Chubisson.
Chubisson.
Ms. Horvath.
Ms. Horvath.
Mr. Novo.
Mr. Novo.
Mr. Marchese.
Mr. Marchese.
Mr. Prue.
Mr. Prue.
Ms. Taylor.
Ms. Taylor.
Mr. Natashak.
Mr. Natashak.
Mr. Tabbins.
Mr. Tabbins.
Mr. Singh.
Mr. Singh.
Ms. Fife.
Ms. Fife.
Ms. Forrester.
Ms. Forrester.
Mr. Vantoff.
Mr.
Mr. O'Toole.
Mr. O'Toole.
Ms. Armstrong.
Ms. Armstrong.
Mr. Mantha.
Mr. Mantha.
Mr. Miller, Hamilton East Stony Creek.
Mr. Miller, Hamilton East Stony Creek.
Ms. Sattler.
Ms. Sattler.
Mr. Hatfield.
Mr. Hatfield.
Mr. Bradley.
Mr. Bradley.
Ms. Armstrong.
Ms. Jassy.
Ms. Jassy.
Ms. Jassic.
Ms. Albanese.
Ms. Albanese.
Ms. Wong.
Ms. Wong.
All those opposed, please rise and remain standing.
Mr. Malloy.
Mr. Malloy.
Mrs. Jeffries.
Mrs. Jeffries.
Ms. Matthews.
Ms. Matthews.
Madame Mayor.
Madame Mayor.
Ms. McCharles.
Ms. McCharles.
Mr. Bardinetti.
Mr. Bardinetti.
Mr. Dillon.
Mr. Dillon.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Chan.
Mr. Chan.
Mr. Murray.
Mr. Murray.
Mr. Delaney.
Mr. Delaney.
Mr. Flynn.
Mr. Flynn.
Mr. Morrow.
Mr. Morrow.
Mr. McNeely.
Mr. McNeely.
Mr. Cadre.
Mr. Quadri.
Mr. Coteau.
Mr. Coteau.
Mr. Sergio.
Mr. Sergio.
Mr. Nackby.
Mr. Nackby.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Dixon.
Mr. Dixon.
Ms. Hunter.
Ms. Hunter.
Mr. Fraser.
Mr. Fraser.
Mr. Del Duca.
Mr. Del Duca.
Ms. Domerlin.
Ms. Domerlin.
Mrs. Mangat.
Ms. Mangat.
Mr. Wilson.
Mr. Wilson.
Mr. Arnott.
Mr. Arnott.
Mr. Hardeman.
Mr. Hardeman.
Mr. Fideli.
Mr. Fideli.
Mr. Miller, Perry, Sal Muskoka.
Mr. Miller, Perry Sound Muskoka.
Mr. Holiday.
Mr. Holiday.
Mrs. Monroe.
Mrs. Monroe.
Mr. Chudley.
Mr. Chudley.
Mrs. McKenna.
Mrs. McKenna.
Mr. Walker.
Mr. Walker.
Mr. Nichols.
Mr. Nichols. The ayes are 24, the nays are 36.
The ayes are 24, the nays are 36. I declare the motion lost. So that's just it.